There is something peculiar about the way Mu disappeared, not once, but twice. The first time, according to those who studied it, it sank beneath the Pacific in a catastrophe so total it left only myths. The second time, it vanished from serious academic discourse so completely that the erasure itself demands examination. I am not a believer in lost continents. I want to establish that plainly before we go any further. What I am is someone who noticed an unusual consistency in the way this particular subject was handled, and consistency in the historical record is always worth a closer look, not because it proves anything, but because it asks a question that hasn't been properly answered. The mainstream position is scientifically well grounded and deserves to be stated fairly. Plate tectonic theory, confirmed through decades of ocean floor mapping, tells us that no large landmass has submerged beneath the Pacific within any time frame relevant to human civilization. The ocean floor is geologically young, dense, and structurally incompatible with the kind of continental crust that supports habitation. For most researchers, that settles it. The idea of a sunken Pacific continent gets filed alongside Hollow Earth speculation, colourful, historically interesting, and obviously wrong. That response feels natural, even intellectually responsible. When geology speaks this firmly, we tend to stop asking other kinds of questions. That is exactly where I want to begin. The name Mu comes from a specific historical moment. In 1864, the French scholar Charles Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg was translating the Troano Codex, one of only a handful of surviving Mayan manuscripts, when he encountered passages he interpreted as describing a catastrophic land submersion. He identified the drowned land using consonants from the manuscript text itself and named it Mu. His translation was later disputed and largely abandoned by mainstream Mayan scholarship, which is the official account, and it may well be the correct one. Brasseur de Bourbourg's methodology had genuine weaknesses, and later scholars produced more defensible readings of the same passages. I acknowledge that directly. What I find harder to set aside is the specific texture of how that dismissal unfolded. Academic rejection typically generates a paper trail, published critiques, institutional debates, formal refutations. What surrounds Brasseur de Bourbourg's Mu interpretation is largely absence, not refutation but silence. The silence of professional consensus deciding, collectively and without stated reasoning, that this particular question was not worth the effort of a recorded response. Brasseur de Bourbourg was not a fringe figure. He was a respected linguist and ethnographer whose translations of other Mayan texts, including substantial work on the Popol Vuh, are still cited in academic literature today. When his Troano interpretation was set aside, it was not set aside through careful published counter-argument, it was set aside by being ignored. Augustus Le Plongeon followed a nearly identical arc. Le Plongeon was a trained archaeologist who spent years conducting systematic fieldwork at Chichen Itza in the 1870s and 1880s. Serious documented work that produced substantial photographic and physical evidence of Mayan ruins. He proposed that Mayan and Egyptian civilizations shared a common ancestor tied to a submerged Pacific landmass. His conclusions were rejected, and that rejection is understandable on its own terms. But what happened to his materials is a more specific problem. Le Plongeon donated artifacts and documentation to major American institutional collections. His photographs, among the earliest systematic archaeological photographs taken in the Americas, were used by subsequent researchers. His interpretive work was not published, not refuted, not engaged with and then criticized in the formal record, simply not published. He died in 1908, professionally isolated, describing the academic establishment as a closed circle, unwilling to examine evidence that disrupted its frameworks. That may reflect the bitterness of a difficult man at the end of a frustrated career, but his documentation was never fully accounted for. What specifically happened to Le Plongeon's photographic archive is worth noting on its own terms. He produced hundreds of detailed photographs of Chichen Itza during the 1870s, documentation that was genuinely significant for Mayan studies. Those images entered institutional collections and were used in subsequent publications. The theoretical frameworks that motivated his fieldwork in the first place were not. Le Plongeon was by many accounts combative and grandiose in ways that made cautious colleagues deeply uncomfortable. I want to name that directly because it is the standard explanation for his marginalization, and it may be the correct one. One difficult researcher pushed to the margins of a conservative institution is not a pattern. It is academic politics, and it happens everywhere. But then James Churchward enters the record, and the texture of the pattern shifts. Churchward, a British-American author and former military officer, published The Lost Continent of Mu in 1926, claiming he had spent years translating ancient clay tablets, the so-called Nahal tablets, shown to him by an Indian temple priest. The academic response was immediate and unanimous dismissal. That dismissal rests on one specific and legitimate ground. The Nahal tablets have never been independently located, photographed, or examined by any other researcher. A source that cannot be independently verified is not a source within the framework of serious scholarship. That standard exists for essential methodological reasons, and I am not asking you to abandon it here. What I am asking is what happened after the dismissal. Churchward stated clearly that the tablets were held in India by a specific temple institution, a claim that is, in principle, checkable. It was not checked with any documented rigor in the decades following his publication. No formal inquiry, no archaeological mission, no institutional investigation. The claim was noted and set aside. The Lost Continent of Mu sold well and attracted a wide general readership. It also permanently attached to Churchward a reputation that made serious scholarly engagement with his claims professionally costly for anyone who attempted it. That dynamic, where association with a discredited idea becomes professionally dangerous, shapes what questions get asked next, and for how long they keep being asked. Around the same time, a mineralogist and field archaeologist named William Niven was excavating in the Valley of Mexico and documenting thousands of buried stone tablets bearing symbols he found structurally similar to Churchward's published Nahal characters. Niven was a legitimate researcher. His mineral and geological finds in Mexico appear in the documented scientific record. His stone tablets were noted, then quietly forgotten. I want to pause here because this is precisely the moment when the temptation to overreach becomes strongest. Niven's tablets have alternative explanations. Stone tablets with symbolic inscriptions appear throughout Mesoamerican archaeology, and without rigorous independent dating and linguistic analysis, attributing them to any shared origin is speculative. The lack of follow-up study is troubling, but troubling is not conclusive. What is harder to explain is the consistency of non-engagement across the sequence. Not one figure, not two, but a series: Brasseur de Bourbourg, Le Plongeon, Churchward, Niven, each working through different methods, different materials, in different countries and different decades, each gesturing towards similar conclusions, each receiving the same institutional response, not refutation, but quiet burial. Consider what that sequence actually represents. It spans roughly 60 years, from Brasseur de Bourbourg's Troano translation in the 1860s through Niven's Mexican fieldwork in the 1920s. It crosses French, American, British, and Mesoamerican scholarly traditions. It involves independent researchers who did not, in several cases, have access to each other's primary materials, and the response to each shares the same specific texture. You could argue, as many do, that each case has its own individual explanation. Translation flawed, archaeologist difficult, evidence unverifiable, context missing. These are defensible positions, and I have spent real time sitting with each. But there is a structural problem with explaining a consistent pattern entirely through individualized causes. The pattern itself is the data point that no individual explanation addresses. The structural problem is this: these researchers were not collaborating. Several were working in different countries, different academic traditions, without access to each other's materials. For the uniformity of institutional response to have been deliberately coordinated, it would have required sustained cooperation between competing institutions, universities, museums, geological surveys, scholarly journals, across different national contexts, and 6 decades. That level of coordination is difficult to sustain even between institutions that share explicit goals and communicate regularly. Between institutions that were frequently in direct competition, different national traditions, different funding structures, different theoretical commitments, sustained conspiratorial alignment would have been essentially impossible to engineer in practice. And yet the consistency is precisely what the historical record shows. When competing institutions respond to an entire class of claims with the same specific texture of silence, not disproof, but marginalization, it begins to look less like independent scientific judgment and more like a shared institutional reflex. A reflex does not require a director. It requires only a shared instinct, and shared instincts in institutional settings emerge from shared interests. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying, because this is where the reasoning most easily distorts. I am not suggesting a secret committee of scholars convened to erase Mu from history. Named conspiracies require named evidence, and named evidence does not exist. What I am pointing toward is something more structural and in its own way more troubling: institutions protecting their own coherence. 19th and early 20th century scientific institutions in geology, archaeology, and anthropology were engaged in a paradigm consolidation project, establishing frameworks that would define their fields for the following century. A seriously examined Pacific landmass would have forced a fundamental rethinking of migration theory, cultural diffusion models, and geological chronology simultaneously. Consolidating institutions do not absorb that kind of disruption gracefully. They bury anomalies instead, not through conspiracy, but through accumulated professional incentives. What gets funded, what gets published, what graduate students are steered toward, what survey courses describe as fringe, and what they describe as settled. These mechanisms do not require a director. They operate through shared institutional logic, and they are extraordinarily effective at making questions disappear without anyone deciding that questions should disappear. The practical mechanism is less dramatic than it sounds. A department chair declines to supervise a dissertation on Pacific submersion evidence because the association would damage the student's career. A journal editor returns a paper without review because the framing is considered speculative. A museum cataloguer files Niven's tablets under unclassified materials, where they remain unchallengeable and unexamined for decades. No single decision is suppression, the accumulation is. The silence organized itself. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912 and was dismissed by the geological establishment for 50 years before plate tectonics confirmed his central insight. The mechanism that buried his work is not mysterious. It is the normal behavior of disciplines protecting established frameworks. I am suggesting the same mechanism applied to Mu, though with a different outcome. The difference is that Wegener eventually prevailed, because his evidence accumulated beyond the point where institutional suppression was geologically sustainable. The researchers associated with Mu had no equivalent accumulation. Their evidence was thinner, their methodology often weaker, the geological counter-evidence considerably stronger. I am not claiming the cases are equivalent in their outcomes. I am claiming the institutional mechanism is recognizable in both. I want to state clearly what this investigation establishes and what it does not. It establishes that a sequence of serious researchers engaged with evidence pointing toward a shared Pacific origin question, that those researchers were consistently sidelined rather than refuted, and that the logic driving that sidelining did not require explicit coordination to be effective. It does not establish that Mu existed. Those are different claims. The geological case against a sunken Pacific continent remains powerful. Ocean floor surveys conducted through the 20th century, including systematic work by the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, found no evidence of submerged continental crust in the Pacific consistent with the Mu hypothesis. That is real data gathered through rigorous methodology, and I am not in a position to dismiss it. I am not trying to. What I am asking is that you hold two things simultaneously without forcing them to resolve. The geological evidence against a literal sunken continent is compelling. The pattern of institutional response to Mu research, stretching across half a century, through multiple researchers and national contexts, has a texture that pure scientific consensus alone does not fully explain. Both things can be true at the same time. There is one more detail I keep returning to, and it changes the texture of the question. When Brasseur de Bourbourg was working with the Troano Codex, he was working with one of only a handful of surviving Mayan manuscripts in existence. Those few survived because they were already in European collections before the destruction began. In 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of Mayan written records across the Yucatan. De Landa documented the destruction himself, explicitly in his own written account. He was clear about his purpose: to eliminate texts he considered idolatrous. That erasure is historically unambiguous, formally documented and confessed. What it also destroyed was the textual record that might have settled Brasseur de Bourbourg's reading of the Troano Codex definitively, not necessarily in Mu's favour, but in any clear direction at all. What de Landa's burning accomplished, in this specific context, was to make the surviving Mayan textual record permanently vulnerable to interpretive instability. With most primary documents gone, any reading of what remained was exposed to challenge simply because there was not enough surviving text to test it against. Brasseur de Bourbourg's interpretation could be dismissed partly because there was nothing left to decisively confirm or refute it. The connection I am drawing is structural, not conspiratorial. De Landa was not suppressing Mu research. He was acting 3 centuries before the Mu question was formulated. But the effect on any 19th century researcher working with surviving Mayan texts is identical. A record with enormous deliberate gaps, treated by later institutions as though those gaps are the natural condition of the archive, rather than a catastrophic interruption of it. The Pacific Basin carries oral traditions describing a homeland lost beneath the ocean. Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian cultures each preserve versions of this memory across thousands of miles of open water. The stories are not identical, and I am not forcing them into a single narrative, but their geographic distribution, spanning an ocean that covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface, is itself a form of data. Anthropologists rightly caution against forcing divergent oral traditions into unified origin myths. That caution is methodologically sound, and I hold it. What it does not explain is why sustained comparative study of these Pacific traditions, work that could be conducted entirely without reference to Mu, has remained so thin relative to the scale of cultural territory it would cover. The question was available, the scholarly investment was not. There is a meaningful difference between work that has been done and found nothing, and work that has simply never been prioritized. In the case of comparative Pacific oral tradition studies, focused specifically on submersion narratives, the second condition describes much of the 20th century's scholarly output on this question. Choices about what not to investigate are how disciplinary silences form and persist across generations. I have tried to exhaust every reasonable explanation for the pattern I have described. Some of it dissolves under scrutiny. Individual personalities, methodological failures, unverifiable sources. I want to be honest about that. But some of it thickens, and the thickening is not in any single case. It is in the consistency connecting them across 6 decades and multiple scholarly traditions. The part that thickens most persistently is this: each of these researchers was treated not as someone who was wrong, but as someone who was not worth engaging with. That is a different epistemic response. When you refute a claim, you produce a counter-argument that can itself be examined and challenged. When you ignore a claim, you preserve the question intact. You simply make it less visible to whoever comes next. Less visible is precisely how questions disappear from the academic record, not through disproof, but through accumulated institutional indifference. Graduate students chose other topics because the threads led nowhere professionally. Journals declined the work because the paradigm allowed no room for it. The silence became self-reinforcing, and self-reinforcing silences from any distance look exactly like settled questions. That is precisely the point. I have been sitting with this long enough to know that certainty is not available here, and I will not reach for it. What I have found is a pattern with a specific shape, not the shape of myth defeated by evidence, but the shape of inquiry discouraged before evidence could accumulate. That is a different shape, and it carries a different kind of weight than a question that was simply asked and answered. The silence around Mu is not the silence of a question that has been answered. It is the silence of a question that stopped being asked at a specific historical moment through mechanisms that are partially visible in the record if you look carefully enough. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because those two silences appear identical from the outside, but carry completely different implications for what might still lie beneath them. And the more carefully you trace how this particular silence formed, the individuals who pressed the question and were sidelined, the materials that were accepted and never published, the patterns that accumulated across 6 decades without a single systematic refutation, the less it resembles the natural product of good science, the more it resembles something else entirely. A door found in the deepest part of the archive, shut from the inside, by people who may never have needed to agree on why.